They say a family is built on a foundation of unconditional love, but no one ever tells you exactly who is expected to pour the concrete. I loved my family, I really did. But as I stood in the center of the warm kitchen, I was just so incredibly tired. My name is Rachel. I am 42 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I have been the invisible glue holding everyone together. It was Thanksgiving morning, and the house already smelled of roasted sage and melted butter. I had been awake since 4 in the morning, prepping the turkey and chopping vegetables. My lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar ache. I wiped my hands on my stained apron, letting out a long, heavy sigh. The front door opened with a loud click. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. It was my mother, Susan. She walked into the kitchen carrying a single store-bought pie. She placed it carefully on the pristine granite counter as if she had just delivered a masterpiece. "Happy Thanksgiving, Rachel," she announced, looking around the room. I smiled, pushing a stray lock of hair out of my eyes. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," I replied. "Thank you for bringing the pie." Susan did not ask if I needed help. She did not notice the mountain of dirty bowls in the sink or the dark circles under my eyes. Instead, she walked past me and headed straight into the formal dining room. I followed her, carrying a stack of folded linen napkins. I had spent an hour ironing them last night, making sure they were perfect. Susan stopped at the head of the long wooden table. She crossed her arms and tilted her head, inspecting the place settings. Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. "Rachel," she sighed, her voice laced with disappointment. "Why are we using the everyday plates? I told you this was a special occasion. We have guests coming." I set the napkins down, feeling a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. "The good china is chipped, Mom," I explained gently, "and it cannot go in the dishwasher. I am cooking for 12 people today, and I just cannot hand wash all those delicate plates tonight." Susan shook her head, tracing a finger over the edge of a plain white dinner plate. "It just looks so cheap," she murmured almost to herself. "Your sister Amanda always has such beautiful table settings at her house. She knows how to create an elegant atmosphere." The comparison stung just like it always did. Amanda had not hosted a family holiday in 5 years. She always claimed her house was too small or her schedule was simply too hectic. So the responsibility always fell to me. I swallowed the lump of frustration rising in my throat. I wanted to tell my mother that elegance was easy when you were not the one doing all the heavy lifting. I wanted to ask her why Amanda was not here right now helping me peel 10 pounds of potatoes, but I kept my mouth shut. I kept the peace just like I had been taught to do. "I will add some fresh flowers to the centerpieces, Mom," I offered, forcing a polite smile. "It will brighten up the table." Susan waved her hand dismissively, turning back toward the living room. "Just do your best, Rachel," she called out over her shoulder. "I am going to sit down and rest my feet." The drive over was completely exhausting. I stood alone in the dining room looking at the empty chairs. The silence wrapped around me, heavy and suffocating. I picked up a napkin, smoothing out a wrinkle that was not really there. I was doing my best, I thought to myself. I was always doing my best, but somehow it was never quite enough. I turned back toward the kitchen, walking toward the mountain of dishes waiting for me. The day had barely begun, and I was already counting down the hours until it was over. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering played out exactly like this. I was the engine running in the background, making sure the train reached the station while everyone else enjoyed the scenery. I closed my eyes for just a second, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator. I rubbed my temples, trying to massage away the tension headache that was slowly building. I knew I had to get back to the stove, but for one quiet minute, I just allowed myself to feel the crushing weight of being the reliable one. The oven timer buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. I opened the heavy glass door, and a cloud of hot air rushed over my face. I pulled out the roasted Brussels sprouts, setting the heavy pan onto the stove. 2 hours had passed since my mother arrived, and the house was finally ready. The table was set, the wine was breathing, and the turkey was perfectly browned. Just as I started to wipe down the countertops for the 4th time, the front doorbell chimed. I wiped my damp forehead with the back of my hand. I could hear my mother practically running down the hallway to answer the door. "Oh, my darlings!" Susan shrieked, her voice filled with a bright, sparkling joy she had not shown me all morning. "You made it!" I walked into the foyer holding a wet dish towel. Amanda stepped inside looking like she had just walked off a magazine cover. She wore a tailored emerald green dress, and her hair was perfectly styled in loose, effortless waves. David, her husband, trailed closely behind her, checking his phone and ignoring the festive atmosphere completely. He wore a crisp blue button-down shirt and expensive loafers. Neither of them carried a casserole dish, a bottle of wine, or even a bag of dinner rolls. Their hands were completely empty. "We are so sorry we are late, Mom," Amanda said, leaning in to kiss our mother on the cheek. Traffic on the interstate was just an absolute nightmare, and David had to take a very important work call right as we were leaving. Susan waved her hand, dismissing the apology instantly. "Oh, do not be silly, Amanda. I know how incredibly busy you two are. You work so hard, and you deserve to take your time. You look absolutely stunning, by the way. That color is perfect on you." I stood near the archway, feeling invisible. I had been awake for 8 hours cooking a massive feast, and my mother was praising Amanda for simply showing up. "Hi, Amanda," I said quietly, trying to make my presence known. "Hi, David. Glad you guys made it safely." Amanda turned as if she had just noticed I was standing there. "Oh, hi, Rachel," she said, giving me a quick, tight smile. "The house smells good. Are we eating soon? Because I am absolutely starving." I skipped breakfast just to save room for the turkey. David finally looked up from his phone, sliding it into his pocket. "Happy Thanksgiving, Rachel," he mumbled, rubbing his stomach. "Do you happen to have any of those little appetizers ready, because it has been a long drive? Also, I would love a cold beer if you have one handy." I tightened my grip on the damp dish towel. I had prepared a beautiful cheese board and placed it on the coffee table an hour ago, but it had not occurred to David to simply look for himself. "Of course, David," I replied, my voice dangerously even. "Let me get that for you right now. The appetizers are in the living room." Susan clapped her hands together, ushering them toward the plush sofas. "Come sit down, you two. You must be exhausted. Rachel will bring the drinks in just a minute. Relax and tell me all about your new kitchen renovations." I watched them walk away, a perfectly happy trio, completely oblivious to the exhaustion radiating off my body. I walked back into the kitchen, the swinging door shutting behind me. I opened the refrigerator, pulling out a cold beer for David and a chilled glass of white wine for Amanda. They had contributed nothing to this day, yet they were treated like royalty. I poured the wine, feeling a slow, quiet resentment pooling in my chest. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn that kind of effortless affection from my mother, but I was beginning to realize it was a prize I was never meant to win. I balanced the heavy tray holding the cold beer and the glass of white wine. I walked out of the kitchen and stepped into the warm living room. The sound of their laughter hit me like a physical wall. Susan was sitting in the center of the sofa, leaning forward, completely captivated by a funny story Amanda was telling. David was slouched deep in the armchair, scrolling on his phone again. I approached him and handed him the damp bottle. "Thank you, Rachel," he muttered. not even lifting his eyes from the glowing screen. I walked over to Amanda and carefully handed her the wine. She took a slow sip, nodding along to whatever our mother was saying. "Thanks, Rach," she said casually, turning her back toward me to finish her story. "Dinner will be ready in 15 minutes, I announced to the room. Susan waved a manicured hand, dismissing the interruption entirely. "Take your time, sweetie," she said. "We are perfectly comfortable right here." I turned around and walked back to the kitchen. The heavy swinging door closed behind me, instantly cutting off the joyful sounds of family bonding. I stood in the center of the kitchen, completely alone. The air was thick and heavy with the smell of roasted meat. The counters were covered in sticky mixing bowls, measuring cups, and discarded vegetable peels. I walked over to the sink and turned on the hot water. I squeezed a drop of blue soap onto a sponge. I picked up the heavy roasting pan and began to scrub the burnt edges. The hot water scalded my bare hands, but I welcomed the sting. It was a sharp physical distraction from the hollow ache in my chest. I watched the grease wash down the drain, thinking about how easily my daily efforts were swallowed up and completely forgotten. I scrubbed the metal pan, moving the sponge in tight, angry circles. I thought about the last 20 years. I thought about every single holiday meal I had cooked completely alone. I thought about every family vacation I had organized, budgeted, and planned down to the very last detail. I thought about every birthday present I had carefully selected, purchased, wrapped, and signed from all of us just to make sure no one felt left out. I looked down at my hands. They were red, swollen, and completely raw. My knuckles ached from hours of chopping, slicing, and endless stirring. I stopped scrubbing and set the wet sponge down on the edge of the sink. I leaned my hands against the cold porcelain, letting my head drop forward. I closed my eyes and took a deep, trembling breath. My lower back screamed in protest, a physical reminder of the heavy, invisible weight I was constantly carrying. Through the thick wooden door, I could hear another loud burst of laughter from the living room. It was a happy, careless sound. It was the sound of people who had absolutely no idea how much effort it took to create their comfort. They did not know because I never let them see the struggle. I swallowed my frustration every single time. I kept the peace just to keep the family together. I played the role of the perfect, accommodating daughter and the reliable, sturdy sister. I opened my eyes, looking at my blurry reflection in the dark evening window. A quiet, terrifying realization washed over me. The deep resentment I felt toward my mother and my sister was entirely justified, but it was also my own creation. I had trained them to treat me exactly this way. I had taught them that my time, my energy, and my peace of mind were completely expendable. I was the family doormat simply because I kept lying down right in front of the door. A strange, profound calmness suddenly settled over my mind. The burning anger slowly drained out of my body, leaving behind a cold, hard, and unbreakable resolve. I reached out and turned off the hot water faucet. The sudden rushing silence in the kitchen was deafening. I grabbed a paper towel and dried my hands with slow, very deliberate movements. I realized in that quiet moment that I did not need to scream at them. I did not need to throw a tantrum, flip the beautiful dining table, or throw the roasted turkey out the window. Screaming would only make me look hysterical, and they would simply dismiss my feelings just like they always did. Instead, I made a silent, powerful vow to myself, standing right there in the messy, overheated kitchen. I was going to stop. I was going to completely stop overcompensating for their endless lack of effort. I was going to stop reminding them of important dates and family obligations. I was going to stop anticipating their every single need before they even asked. I tossed the damp paper towel into the garbage can. I untied the strings of my stained apron, pulling it over my head and draping it over a kitchen chair. I smoothed down the front of my dress, taking one final cleansing breath. The heavy, invisible burden I had carried for 2 long decades was finally going to be set down. I was going to let their perfect little system break. I pushed open the kitchen door, walking out to serve the beautiful dinner, knowing deep down it would be the very last time I ever did it alone. The morning after Thanksgiving, the house was perfectly quiet. I sat at the kitchen table holding a hot mug of coffee. The mountain of dishes from the night before was finally gone, but the deep exhaustion still lingered in my bones. I picked up my phone, staring at the bright screen. The family group chat named the Miller Family Hub was already buzzing with notifications. My mother, Susan, had sent 3 messages in a row. "Good morning, everyone," she wrote. "We need to finalize the details for the winter cabin trip next month. Rachel, did you book the rental yet?" Amanda chimed in right after. "Yes, and please make sure it has a hot tub this time, Rach," she added. "The kids really want to swim, and David needs a place to relax after his long work weeks." Normally, this was my immediate cue. Normally, I would open 3 different tabs on my laptop before my coffee was even cold. I would spend hours comparing prices, checking availability, and reading hundreds of customer reviews. I would front the large deposit with my own credit card, carefully track who owed what, and politely beg David and Amanda to pay me back weeks later. I would plan the daily meal schedule, buy all the groceries, and pack extra blankets just in case someone felt chilly. I hovered my thumb over the keyboard. I felt that familiar heavy pressure in my chest. The urge to fix it, to make everyone happy, to be the reliable daughter, was incredibly strong. It was a deeply ingrained habit, a painful reflex I had perfected over 20 long years. But then I remembered the silent vow I made in the kitchen yesterday. I remembered the cold, raw sting of my hands in the soapy water and the sound of their careless laughter floating in from the other room. I slowly pulled my thumb away from the glass screen. I set the phone down on the wooden table face down. I did not type a reply. I did not open my heavy laptop. I simply picked up my warm mug, took a slow sip of coffee, and watched the morning light filter softly through the window. 2 hours passed. My phone buzzed again, vibrating aggressively against the hard wood. I ignored it. I walked into the living room, picked up a novel I had been trying to read for 3 months, and sat down on the comfortable sofa. I read an entire chapter completely uninterrupted. By noon, the group chat was starting to sound frantic. I finally picked up the phone and scrolled through the barrage of new messages. Susan was getting impatient. "Rachel, are you there?" she typed. "The cabins fill up so fast this time of year, and we simply cannot wait any longer." Amanda followed up, adding a long string of confused emojis. "Earth to Rachel," she wrote. "David needs to put in his vacation request by tomorrow morning. What are the exact dates we are going?" I took a deep, steadying breath. I tapped the reply bar and carefully typed a response. I made sure my tone was polite, helpful, and completely detached. "Hi, everyone," I typed. "I am taking a step back from organizing the family trip this year. I have a lot on my plate right now. Amanda, since David needs specific dates, it might be easier if you two handled the booking this time. Let me know what you decide, and I will happily transfer my portion of the money." I hit send. I placed the phone back on the coffee table, feeling a sudden sharp thrill of pure adrenaline. It was a terrifying, wonderful feeling. I was stepping off the edge of a high cliff, completely unsure if a net would be there to catch me. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the digital equivalent of a loud, jarring record scratch. For 10 long minutes, no one typed a single word. I could practically see them staring at their screens, completely paralyzed by the sudden massive shift in the universe. Rachel, the reliable workhorse, had just refused to pull the heavy cart. Finally, Susan replied. Her message was short and laced with quiet indignation. "Well," she wrote, "I suppose we will just have to figure it out ourselves." Amanda quickly added, "I am super busy with work right now, Rach, but I guess David can look into it tonight when he gets home." I smiled, leaning back against the plush cushions. I knew with absolute certainty that David would not look into it tonight. David hated planning things. Amanda hated dealing with strict budgets. My mother hated making final decisions. They were a ship without a steering wheel, and they were about to realize exactly how hard it was to navigate the turbulent waters of family planning. I closed my eyes, letting out a long, deeply contented sigh. For the first time in 20 years, the upcoming winter trip was not my problem to solve. If they booked a tiny cabin without a hot tub, it was not my fault. If they forgot to buy groceries, I would not be the one rushing out to a strange supermarket in the freezing cold. I was finally off the clock, and the quiet freedom felt absolutely intoxicating. The cracks in their perfectly designed system began to show exactly 1 week later. I had spent years managing a massive shared digital family calendar. I was the silent, dedicated administrator of our entire lives. I spent 2 hours every weekend coordinating everyone else's schedules. I tracked doctor appointments, school holidays, and even David's frequent business trips. I made sure my mother never missed her weekly bridge game, and I made sure Amanda never forgot to buy supplies for the school bake sale. I added the appointments, I set the alerts, and I always sent out a polite, helpful text message every Sunday evening reminding everyone of the upcoming week. It was a massive, unpaid part-time job, and I performed it flawlessly. I reminded David about the important financial deadlines for the family because Amanda always claimed she was too overwhelmed to deal with numbers. When I made my silent vow in the kitchen, I simply stopped updating the shared calendar. I deleted the scheduling application from my phone and I completely skipped the Sunday reminder text. I let the days pass quietly and peacefully. I focused entirely on my own work, my own home, and my own breathing. It happened on a cold Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk in my quiet office reviewing a lengthy quarterly report when my cell phone rang. The caller identification flashed David's name. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting it out slowly, and answered the call. "Hello, David," I said, keeping my voice light and perfectly neutral. "Rachel, what is going on?" he demanded, completely skipping a polite greeting. His voice was loud, frantic, and filled with a thick, heavy layer of panic. "Tell me, you submitted the paperwork for the seasonal ski passes. Please tell me you just forgot to ask me for the money." I leaned back in my office chair, looking out the large window at the gray winter sky. "I did not submit the paperwork, David," I replied calmly. "I told everyone I was stepping back from the winter trip planning, remember?" David let out a loud, frustrated groan. The dramatic sound echoed harshly through the phone speaker. "But the seasonal passes are a completely separate thing, Rachel," he argued, his tone rising in pitch. "The early registration deadline was yesterday at midnight. I just logged onto the resort website, and the discount portal is completely closed. The prices just doubled. It is going to cost us an extra $2,000 to get the lift passes for Amanda and the kids." "I am very sorry to hear that, David," I said, making sure my voice held absolutely no guilt. "But the ski resort sends out multiple emails about the deadline. Did you not check your inbox this week?" "Of course I got the emails." He snapped back, his frustration boiling over. "But I always delete those. I always rely on your Sunday text message to remind me to actually pay it. You have sent that text message every single year for the last 5 years. Why on earth did you not send it this week?" I picked up a pen, twirling it slowly between my fingers. I did not send the text because I am no longer managing the family schedule, David, I explained quietly. You are a grown man. You have a calendar on your phone. You receive the exact same emails I receive. It is not my responsibility to manage your personal finances or your family vacations. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear David breathing heavily, completely struggling to process my words. It was as if I was speaking a foreign language. He simply could not compute the idea that I was not there to catch him when he carelessly decided to fall. You are being incredibly petty, Rachel, he finally said, his voice dropping into a harsh, accusing whisper. You knew the deadline was coming up. You knew I was completely swamped with work this week. You deliberately let me miss it just to prove some kind of sick point to your sister. I stopped twirling the pen. I placed it carefully down on the wooden desk, feeling a familiar spark of anger, but I quickly extinguished it. I was not going to let him drag me back into the emotional mud. I did not do this to punish you, David, I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. I did this because I am exhausted. I cannot carry my own life and yours and Amanda's and Mom's. I dropped the rope. If you tripped over it, that is entirely on you. He scoffed a loud, dismissive sound. Whatever, Rachel. Amanda is going to be absolutely furious about this extra cost. I hope you are happy with yourself. He ended the call abruptly, cutting off the connection. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the dark, silent screen. He did not apologize for yelling at me during my workday. He did not take a single ounce of personal responsibility for missing his own financial deadline. He simply blamed the entire situation on my lack of free, invisible labor. A few years ago, a phone call exactly like that would have completely ruined my entire week. I would have felt a deep, crushing guilt. I would have immediately called the ski resort, begged a manager for a deadline extension, and secretly offered to pay the difference out of my own savings just to keep the family peace. I would have apologized profusely for my failure to remind him. But today, sitting in my quiet office, I did not feel guilty at all. I felt a strange, profound sense of validation. The old system was finally breaking down exactly as I knew it would. They were stumbling in the dark, realizing for the very first time exactly how much light I had been constantly providing. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet peace of my office wash over me. The ripple effect of my choices was spreading. I knew this was only the beginning. My mother would be calling soon, completely confused about the sudden lack of organization. Amanda would complain about her messy, unmanaged schedule. But I was ready. I built a strong, invisible boundary around my peace of mind, and I was not going to let them tear it down. I picked up my pen, turned my attention back to my quarterly report, and let the natural consequences of their negligence finally run their course. The next day at the office, the break room was quiet and completely empty. I walked over to the coffee machine holding my ceramic mug. Someone had left a sticky puddle of spilled creamer right on the counter. A dirty spoon rested carelessly beside it. My hand instinctively reached for a paper towel. It was a deeply ingrained muscle memory. I was completely conditioned to clean up the messes left by other people, but my fingers froze in midair. I pulled my hand back and let the paper towel fall. I poured my dark coffee, stepping carefully around the sticky spill. Maria. My desk neighbor for the last 5 years walked into the break room. She was holding a heavy stack of files, looking completely exhausted. She stopped staring at the messy counter and then looked right at me. You did not clean it up, she observed, raising one eyebrow in genuine surprise. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. I did not make the mess, Maria, I replied simply. She laughed, setting her heavy files down on a clean table. "Who are you and what have you done with the real Rachel?" she asked, a gentle, teasing tone in her voice. I walked over and sat down in the plastic chair across from her. "I just realized I am off the clock," I explained softly. "I am officially resigning from my unpaid job as the manager of the universe." Maria nodded slowly, studying my face with a careful expression. She knew all about my chaotic family dynamic. She had watched me spend countless lunch breaks ordering birthday cakes for my nephews and booking flights for my mother. "You look different today," she said quietly. "You look a lot lighter, but you also look a little sad." I stared down into my dark coffee, watching the steam rise and twist in the cool air. "I am sad," I admitted, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "I am grieving the person I could have been if I had not spent the last 20 years carrying them." Maria leaned forward, giving me her full, undivided attention. "It started when we were kids," I continued, needing to finally say the heavy words out loud. "Amanda was always the fragile one. She was the artist. She felt things too deeply, and she needed constant, unwavering support. My mother decided very early on that Amanda needed protection," I said carefully, choosing my words. "And I was the sturdy one. I was the capable sister. I never complained, so they simply assumed I never needed anything." Maria sighed, a soft sound of deep understanding. "You became the foundation," she murmured. I nodded, feeling a tight lump form in my throat. "I became the concrete," I agreed. "But no one ever asks how the concrete feels, Maria. They just walk all over it, expecting it to hold the weight of the entire house." I looked up, meeting her kind, observant eyes. "I spent decades curating my entire personality around being useful," I confessed. "I thought being reliable was the exact same thing as being loved. I thought if I just made their lives perfectly easy, they would eventually notice me. They would finally cherish me. But they did not cherish me, Maria. They just used me. They took my time, my energy, and my peace, and they never once said thank you." I remember my 30th birthday, I told Maria, the painful memories flooding back. I had planned to go to a quiet spa just for one single afternoon, but Amanda called me crying because her babysitter canceled at the very last minute. She was hosting a dinner party and she was absolutely panicked. So I canceled my massage. I drove over to her house and I watched her children for 6 long hours. When she came home, she did not even ask how my birthday was. She just complained about the dry food at her party. Maria squeezed my arm gently. "That is heartbreaking, Rachel," she whispered. I swallowed hard, staring at the blank white wall. It was not just that one birthday, I continued, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. It was every single weekend. I stopped dating because I was always on call for family emergencies. I gave up painting because I never had the time to set up my easel. My entire identity was completely swallowed up by their endless demands. I became a human calendar, an emotional sponge, and a live-in maid who did not actually live there. And now Maria asked, softly tilting her head. "Now I am just tired," I replied, blinking back a sudden wave of hot tears. "David called me yesterday, absolutely screaming at me. He missed a financial deadline for his ski trip because I did not send him a reminder text. He blamed me for his own carelessness." Maria shook her head in sheer disbelief. "That is incredibly toxic, Rachel," she said firmly. "He is a grown man." I know, I said, letting out a long, heavy breath, but the terrifying part is I almost apologized to him. The urge to fix his mistake, to pay the difference, and to smooth things over was so incredibly strong. It is like an addiction, Maria. I am completely addicted to being the savior because without that specific role, I do not even know who I am. "You are Rachel, Maria said, her voice filled with quiet strength. You are a brilliant, capable woman who truly deserves to rest. You deserve to have your own life separate from their constant drama. Finding your identity outside of their needs is going to be incredibly painful, but it is the only way to survive. I looked at the spilled creamer on the counter across the room. It was beginning to dry into a hard, sticky stain. Someone else will eventually clean it, Maria added, following my steady gaze. The world will not end just because you finally sit down. I smiled a small, genuine smile of pure relief. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe my tight throat. I know I whispered into the quiet room. Let them stumble. Let them figure out how to book their own trips and clean their own kitchens. I am officially done pouring the concrete. The quiet peace of my apartment was completely shattered on Thursday evening. I was standing at my kitchen counter chopping fresh vegetables for a simple solitary dinner. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the wooden cutting board was incredibly soothing. I poured myself a small glass of red wine, letting out a long, contented sigh. For the very first time in weeks, my shoulders were completely relaxed. I was not rushing to finish a task for someone else. I was simply existing in my own space. Suddenly, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the granite countertop. The bright screen illuminated the dim kitchen, flashing a picture of my mother, Susan. I stopped chopping the carrots. I set the heavy knife down and stared at the glowing phone. A familiar heavy knot of anxiety instantly formed in my stomach. I knew exactly why she was calling. The inevitable collapse of the winter trip planning had finally reached her front door. I let the phone ring 4 times, taking a slow, deep breath before I finally reached out to answer it. "Hello, Mom," I said, keeping my voice soft and perfectly neutral. "Rachel, it is a complete and absolute disaster," Susan announced, completely bypassing a standard greeting. Her voice was loud, sharp, and filled with a frantic, buzzing energy. I could hear her pacing heavily across her hardwood floors in the background. "Amanda and David have completely ruined the family winter trip, and I need you to step in and fix it right this minute." I picked up my glass of wine, taking a slow, deliberate sip. I leaned my back against the cool refrigerator door. "What happened, Mom?" I asked carefully, keeping any trace of emotion out of my tone. "What happened?" Susan repeated, her pitch rising dramatically. "I will tell you exactly what happened, Rachel. David finally got around to looking for a cabin last night. But because he waited so incredibly long, everything decent is completely sold out. He ended up booking a tiny, depressing little shack located 30 miles away from the actual ski resort." She paused, letting out a loud theatrical gasp for air. "And Rachel, it only has 1 single bathroom," she cried out as if she were delivering the tragic news of a natural disaster. "1 bathroom for 6 grown people and 2 young children. Can you even imagine the absolute chaos in the mornings? There is no hot tub, there is no fireplace, and David did not even bother to check if they provide clean bath towels. You know how incredibly sensitive my skin is to cheap detergents. I simply cannot stay in a place like that." I listened to her frantic, breathless rant, feeling a strange, hollow sense of complete detachment. A few months ago, this exact phone call would have triggered an immediate adrenaline rush. I would have felt a desperate, overwhelming need to rescue her from the minor inconvenience. I would have immediately opened my laptop, scoured the internet for hidden luxury rentals, and happily paid the exorbitant late booking fees out of my own pocket just to hear her praise me. "That sounds very stressful, Mom," I replied smoothly. "Did you try talking to David about finding a different place?" "Talk to David?" Susan scoffed, letting out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You cannot talk to David right now, Rachel. He is absolutely furious about having to pay double for the ski lift passes because he missed that stupid discount deadline. He is blaming Amanda for distracting him, and Amanda is locked in her bedroom crying her eyes out. They have been fighting all afternoon, and the entire vacation is going to be completely ruined unless you do something right now. I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead against the cool, smooth metal of the refrigerator. The sheer blinding entitlement in her voice was truly breathtaking. She was openly demanding that I clean up their careless mistakes. She wanted me to spend my own hard-earned money and forcefully insert myself into a toxic marital argument just to guarantee her personal comfort. "I need you to call the terrible rental company," Susan commanded, her voice dropping into a firm, authoritative tone. "Cancel that awful little shack immediately. Then I need you to call the nice, elegant lodge we stayed at last year and book their premium suite. Tell them it is an emergency. Just put the massive deposit on your credit card for now, Rachel. I will personally make sure David pays you back eventually when he finally calms down." She did not ask if I had the available funds. She did not ask if I had the free time to spend hours arguing with customer service agents on the phone. She did not even ask how my workday was. She simply issued her royal decree, fully expecting her reliable invisible servant to fall directly in line and sweep the mess right under the rug. I stood in my quiet kitchen holding my glass of wine. The heavy silence stretched over the phone line as my mother waited for me to agree. She waited for the familiar, accommodating yes that had defined our entire relationship for 20 long years. She was completely certain I would bend because I had always folded myself into tiny pieces just to keep them warm. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I looked at the chopped carrots on my cutting board, focusing on the bright, vibrant color. "I am not going to do that, Mom," I said, my voice steady and remarkably calm. The line went completely dead for 5 long seconds. It was not a dropped call, but a profound, stunned silence. Susan simply could not process the combination of words I had just spoken. "Excuse me," she finally asked, a sharp edge of confusion cutting through her voice. "Did you say you are not going to do it?" "That is exactly what I said, Mom," I replied, taking another small sip of my red wine. "I am not going to cancel their reservation, and I am certainly not going to put a massive luxury suite on my personal credit card. I told everyone last week I was stepping back from planning this trip." Susan let out a loud, incredulous scoff. "But this is different, Rachel," she argued, her tone rapidly shifting from demanding to deeply defensive. "This is an absolute emergency. The family vacation is completely falling apart right before our eyes. You are the only one who knows how to fix these things. You always fix these things." "I know I always fix them, Mom," I said softly, feeling a sudden deep wave of exhaustion wash over me. And that is exactly why David felt comfortable waiting until the very last minute. He assumed I would swoop in just like I always do and save the day. But I am not doing it anymore. They made a careless mistake and now they have to deal with the natural consequences. The defensiveness on the other end of the phone quickly mutated into pure, unfiltered anger. "I cannot believe you are being so incredibly stubborn, Rachel!" Susan snapped, her voice trembling with rising fury. "Your sister is crying in her bedroom right now. Your brother-in-law is stressed out of his mind, and I am facing the prospect of sharing a single tiny bathroom with 5 other people. How can you be so incredibly selfish?" The word selfish hit me like a physical blow to the chest. For 20 years, I had sacrificed my time, my money, and my peace of mind just to make their lives perfectly smooth. I had abandoned my own needs over and over again to cater to their endless whims. And the very first time I said no, the very first time I set a boundary, I was instantly labeled as selfish. "I am not being selfish, Mom. I replied, fighting the urge to raise my voice. I am simply letting two grown adults manage their own vacation. If sharing a bathroom is truly unbearable, then David and Amanda can spend their own money to upgrade the rental. It is their responsibility, not mine. You are punishing us. Susan accused, her voice growing shrill and desperate. You are doing this on purpose just to make us miserable. You are jealous because Amanda has a beautiful family and you are sitting all alone in your quiet apartment. You just want to ruin our happiness. I closed my eyes, feeling a hot tear slip down my cheek. The cruelty in her words was entirely intentional. She knew exactly how to target my deepest, most painful insecurities. She wanted to break my resolve by making me feel incredibly small and deeply unloved. I am not jealous, Mom, I whispered into the phone, my voice cracking slightly. I just want to rest. I want to live my own life without carrying the heavy weight of yours. If you do not fix this right now, Rachel, I am never going to forgive you. Susan threatened, slamming her emotional fist down on the table. You are tearing this family apart over a stupid cabin rental. I opened my eyes, staring at the blank white wall of my kitchen. The concrete foundation I had poured for them was finally cracking, but I was not going to fall with it. I love you, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, unbreakable whisper. But I am not fixing it. I hope you guys figure it out. Have a good night. I pulled the phone away from my ear before she could scream another insult. I pressed the red button, ending the call and completely severing the connection. I stood in the silent kitchen, my hand shaking violently. I had done it. I had held the line. The guilt was heavy and suffocating, but beneath it all, a tiny, brilliant spark of pure freedom was finally beginning to glow. The weekend arrived, bringing a cold, crisp breeze through the busy city. Saturday mornings used to belong entirely to my sister. For the past 4 years, I had a standing, unspoken appointment. Amanda would drop her 2 young boys at my apartment promptly at 10 o'clock. She would hand me a massive diaper bag, kiss their foreheads, and rush off to enjoy her weekly yoga class and a quiet brunch with her friends. It was her designated self-care time, completely funded by my free, invisible labor. But this Saturday, I woke up early, and I made a very different choice. I poured a hot cup of coffee, grabbed my favorite wool coat, and walked out the door before 9 o'clock. I went to a small, quiet bookstore across town, a beautiful place I had not visited in years. I sat down in a plush armchair, reading a novel and making myself completely unreachable. My phone, tucked safely deep inside my purse, was placed on silent mode. When I finally checked the glowing screen around noon, I found a chaotic string of text messages from Amanda. Rach, where are you? The first message read, time-stamped at 10:15. I am standing outside your door with the kids, and it is freezing out here. Open up right now. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. Rachel? This is not funny, she typed. My yoga class starts in 20 minutes. If you are sleeping, wake up immediately. The boys are driving me completely insane in this dark hallway. The final message, sent just before 11, was a frantic, angry plea. Thanks a lot, Rachel, she wrote. I missed my class entirely. David is at the office and I have absolutely no one to help me. I am taking them to the grocery store and I am literally going to lose my mind today. You are the worst sister ever. I sat in the quiet bookstore staring at the bright screen. I did not type a reply. I simply locked the phone, sliding it back into my bag, and took a slow, deep breath. I decided to walk home, taking the long route through the bustling city center. As I turned the corner near the large neighborhood supermarket, I heard a loud, familiar shriek. I stopped, standing near a tall display of winter coats in a shop window, and looked carefully across the crowded street. It was Amanda. She was struggling to push a large silver shopping cart across the icy pavement. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was pulled back into a messy, chaotic knot. Her heavy winter coat was unbuttoned, hanging awkwardly off one shoulder. Her youngest son, Leo, was sitting in the front of the cart, screaming at the very top of his lungs because he had dropped a brightly colored toy onto the wet, dirty ground. Her older son, Max, was pulling violently on her purse strap, demanding a candy bar with relentless whining energy. Amanda looked completely, utterly defeated. She leaned her heavy weight against the metal handle of the cart, letting her head drop forward in total exhaustion. She looked exactly like I had felt on Thanksgiving morning standing alone in that messy kitchen. She looked like a woman who was slowly drowning under the heavy, invisible weight of daily family life. For a brief, painful second, my heart broke for her. The deeply ingrained instinct to run across the busy street, scoop the screaming toddler into my arms, and soothe his tears was incredibly strong. I wanted to take the heavy grocery bags, pay for the food, and send her home to take a long hot bath. I actually took one small step forward, my heavy boots crunching against the hard, icy sidewalk. But then I stopped. I pulled my foot back, planting it firmly on the safe ground. If I crossed that street, the destructive cycle would immediately start all over again. Amanda would hand me the crying child, let out a massive sigh of relief, and instantly forget the deep, crushing pressure she was currently feeling. She would never learn how to soothe his tantrums on her own. She would never realize exactly how much patience and physical energy it took to manage her own chaotic life. She would simply go back to assuming that raising children was easy because I was always there to absorb the absolute hardest parts. I watched her pick up the dropped toy from the wet pavement. She wiped it roughly on her coat, her shoulders shaking slightly in the cold wind. She spoke sharply to Max, finally setting a firm boundary and telling him to let go of her heavy purse. She looked exhausted, completely overwhelmed, and entirely stripped of her usual elegance. But as I watched her force the heavy cart forward, navigating the slushy sidewalk, I saw something else. I saw her actually parenting. I saw her doing the hard, messy, unglamorous work that I usually handled for her behind the scenes. I turned my back to the busy street, pulling my warm scarf tightly around my neck. I walked away, leaving her to fight her own daily battles. It felt cold, and it felt incredibly harsh, but I knew deep down it was the only way she would ever learn to stand on her own 2 feet. The family dynamic was finally shifting, breaking apart under the sudden lack of my constant, unwavering support. The emotional distance between us was growing wider every single day, but for the very first time in my life, I felt like I was finally walking in the right direction. 2 weeks later, the tense, heavy atmosphere finally reached a boiling point. It was the evening of the annual anniversary dinner for my mother, Susan. Even though my father passed away 10 years ago, Susan always insisted on gathering the entire family at an expensive upscale restaurant to celebrate their long marriage. In the past, I was the one who made the strict reservations. I was the one who ordered the custom cake and discreetly handed the waitstaff a generous tip just to ensure everything went perfectly smooth. I would organize the group gift, wrap it in beautiful, expensive paper, and write the heartfelt card on behalf of everyone. But this year, I did absolutely nothing. I simply showed up at the elegant downtown restaurant exactly at 7 in the evening. I walked through the heavy glass front doors wearing a simple, elegant black dress. The hostess, a polite young woman holding a leather menu, smiled brightly at me. I gave her the reservation name, and she led me through the dimly lit dining room. The restaurant was beautiful, filled with the soft, melodic sounds of a live jazz pianist and the quiet clinking of crystal wine glasses. When I reached the large round table near the back window, the cracks in our perfect family dynamic were immediately painfully obvious. Susan was already seated at the head of the table wearing a stiff dark blue suit. Her face was pinched into a tight, severe scowl, and she was glaring sharply at the empty chairs surrounding her. I pulled out my own chair, taking a seat directly across from her. "Happy anniversary, Mom," I said quietly, placing my small, simple purse on the table. Susan did not smile. She simply tapped her watch, a heavy gold timepiece resting on her wrist. "You are exactly 5 minutes late, Rachel," she stated, her voice dripping with cold, sharp disapproval. "And your sister is completely missing in action. This is incredibly disrespectful to your father and to me." I opened my cloth napkin, placing it gently across my lap. "Traffic was a bit heavy tonight, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely detached. "I am sure Amanda and David will be here very soon. They usually run a little bit behind schedule." Normally, I would have immediately pulled out my phone, frantically texting Amanda to find out her exact location. I would have made up a polite, convincing excuse for my mother, smoothing over the uncomfortable tension and absorbing her rising anger. But tonight, I simply picked up the leather wine list and began reading the delicate print. I let the heavy, awkward silence stretch across the large table, refusing to jump in and save the conversation. 15 minutes passed, filled with the loud rhythmic tapping of the manicured fingernails of my mother against the hard wood. Finally, Amanda and David arrived. They practically stumbled toward the table, bringing a chaotic, messy energy that instantly disrupted the quiet, elegant dining room. Amanda looked completely frantic. Her dress, usually perfectly pressed, was visibly wrinkled at the hem. She was carrying her heavy winter coat over one arm and clutching her leather purse with white knuckles. David followed closely behind her, looking completely exhausted and deeply irritable. His collar was unbuttoned, his tie was loose, and he was completely ignoring the hostess who was trying to offer him a clean menu. "We are so incredibly sorry, Mom," Amanda gasped, pulling out a heavy wooden chair and collapsing heavily into it. The babysitter canceled at the very last second. David had to call his mother and beg her to come over to watch the boys. It was an absolute total nightmare of an afternoon. Susan let out a loud, dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes toward the tall ceiling. "You have known about this dinner for 2 entire months, Amanda," she scolded, her voice rising in pitch and completely ignoring the other diners. "How could you be so incredibly disorganized on such an important night?" The face of Amanda flushed a deep, angry red. She looked directly at me, her eyes flashing with a sudden dark resentment. "Well, Mom," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly with barely contained emotion. "We used to have a very reliable backup plan for the children. But our backup plan has decided she is suddenly too busy to help her own family." The blatant accusation hung heavy in the warm air. She was directly blaming me for her own failure to hire a reliable babysitter. She was incredibly angry because I was sitting here peacefully sipping my cold water instead of rushing over to her house to save her evening. I slowly lowered my glass, looking directly into the angry eyes of my sister. "I am not a backup plan, Amanda," I said, my voice quiet but incredibly firm. "I am your sister. Managing your childcare is simply not my responsibility, and it never was." David slammed his heavy menu onto the table, causing the delicate crystal glasses to rattle sharply. "Oh, give it a rest, Rachel," he muttered, rubbing his tired red eyes. "Can we just order a drink and try to pretend we actually like each other tonight? I have had a completely miserable week, and I am simply not in the mood for one of your little lectures." The waiter, a tall young man in a crisp white shirt, approached the table looking incredibly uncomfortable. He held a small notepad, clearing his throat awkwardly in the tense silence. "Good evening," he said, his voice polite but clearly hesitant. "Can I start you off with some beverages or perhaps some light appetizers?" Susan waved her hand abruptly, cutting him off before he could even finish his polite sentence. "Bring us a bottle of your most expensive red wine," she ordered sharply, pointing a firm finger at the young man. "And bring it quickly, please. We have a lot of lost time to make up for, and we are all completely exhausted." The waiter nodded, rushing away from the tense, angry table as fast as he possibly could. I sat back in my comfortable chair, watching my family unravel piece by broken piece. The elegant dinner, meant to be a joyful celebration of love, felt exactly like a slow, painful funeral for our old dynamic. The invisible glue holding us together was completely gone, and without it there was nothing left but raw anger, deep resentment, and a profound, undeniable distance. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the inevitable storm that was quickly approaching. The breaking point was finally here, and I was absolutely ready to face it. The waiter arrived with the expensive bottle of red wine. His hands trembled slightly as he uncorked the dark glass bottle. He poured a small amount for my mother, waiting for her sharp approval. Susan took a tiny sip, nodding her head stiffly. The waiter quickly filled our crystal glasses, practically running away from the tense table as soon as he was finished. Amanda reached for her wine immediately. She did not even wait for a family toast. She took a massive, heavy gulp of the dark liquid, closing her eyes in a theatrical display of pure exhaustion. "You have absolutely no idea," she began, setting the heavy glass down with a loud clink. "You have no idea how incredibly difficult this entire week has been for me." Susan leaned forward, her face instantly melting into an expression of deep, exaggerated sympathy. "Tell me, sweetheart," she cooed gently. "Tell me exactly what happened. You look completely drained." Amanda let out a loud, dramatic sigh, pushing her hair out of her tired eyes. "It is the boy's mom," she complained, her voice carrying a sharp, whining edge that echoed across the quiet dining room. Max had a massive science project due on Wednesday. I had to stay up until midnight gluing tiny cardboard planets together because David was working late. I burned my fingers on the hot glue gun 3 different times. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cold water. I looked at my sister, feeling a strange mixture of pity and complete disbelief. She was complaining about helping her own child with a basic elementary school science project. For the last 4 years, I was the one who bought the poster board. I was the one who bought the markers, and I was the one who sat at the kitchen table helping Max build his solar systems while Amanda took long, relaxing baths. And it is not just the school projects, Amanda continued, her voice rising in pitch and completely ignoring my silent presence. The laundry is literally taking over my entire house. I completely ran out of clean towels on Thursday morning. I had to dry myself off with a tiny, scratchy hand towel. It was absolutely humiliating. I am just so overwhelmed, Mom. I simply cannot keep up with the endless, crushing demands of running a household entirely by myself. Susan reached across the white tablecloth, gently patting the hand of Amanda. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured softly. "Being a working mother is the absolute hardest job in the entire world. You carry so much heavy weight on your delicate shoulders." I watched the two of them, completely fascinated by their deep shared delusion. Amanda worked a very comfortable part-time job exactly 3 days a week. She had a weekly cleaning service, a massive, beautiful house, and a husband who made a very lucrative salary. Her life was not an endless, crushing struggle. Her life was incredibly privileged and entirely cushioned. But the soft cushion was completely gone now, and the hard wooden chair of reality was finally making her uncomfortable. It is just incredibly frustrating, Amanda stated loudly, her eyes darting sharply toward my face. It is incredibly hard to find any kind of balance, especially when your core support system suddenly vanishes into thin air without any warning at all. The harsh words hung heavily over the elegant table. It was not a subtle hint. It was a direct, pointed accusation. She was taking her lack of clean towels and her burnt fingers and laying the heavy blame directly at my feet. She was incredibly angry because the invisible maid had finally quit her unpaid job. I used to have a very manageable routine, Amanda pressed on, swirling the dark wine in her glass. I used to be able to rely on certain people to help me carry the heavy load. Family is supposed to help family, right? But I guess some people just decide they are too incredibly busy or maybe just too selfish to care about their own nephews anymore. David shifted uncomfortably in his heavy wooden chair. He picked up his own glass of wine, taking a quick silent sip. He did not jump in to defend me. He simply let Amanda unleash her rising frustration, perfectly happy to let me take the heavy emotional bullets as long as he did not have to deal with her anger at home. I kept my face completely blank. I did not frown. I did not glare at her. I simply looked at her with the quiet, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a very strange, angry insect. "You are doing a wonderful job, Amanda," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and completely devoid of any sarcasm. "Parenting is a very challenging responsibility. I am sure you will figure out a brand new routine very soon." Amanda slammed her hand down onto the table. The sudden violent movement caused the shiny silverware to jump and clatter loudly against the white china. "I do not want to figure out a new routine, Rachel," she hissed, dropping all pretenses of polite conversation. "I want my old routine back. I want you to stop acting like a cold, distant stranger. I need you to step up and actually be a part of this family again." Susan nodded in firm agreement, turning her sharp, angry gaze toward me. "Your sister is absolutely right, Rachel," she scolded, her tone thick with deep disappointment. "You have been acting incredibly strange for weeks now. You completely ruined the winter trip planning. You refused to help Amanda today. You are sitting here right now acting incredibly superior and completely detached from us. It is deeply hurtful, and I demand to know exactly what is going on with you." I placed my hands gently on my lap, feeling the soft linen napkin under my fingers. My heart was beating a fast, steady rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the three of them. I looked at my tired, angry sister. I looked at my completely passive brother-in-law. I looked at my demanding, entitled mother. They were a perfectly united front, completely convinced of my sudden, inexplicable villainy. They fully expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, apologize profusely, and immediately promise to do better. They expected the old Rachel to suddenly reappear and beg for their quick forgiveness. I did not blink. I looked at the three angry faces staring back at me across the elegant table. They were completely united in their deep shared outrage. Amanda leaned forward, her elbows resting heavily on the pristine white tablecloth. She completely ignored the uncomfortable stares of the other diners sitting nearby. "You abandoned us, Rachel!" Amanda hissed, her voice cutting sharply through the soft melodic jazz music playing in the background. "You just packed up your emotional bags and walked completely away from your own blood. You dropped everything without a single word of warning and left me to drown in my own life." "I am not responsible for your life, Amanda," I replied quietly, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. "I am only responsible for my own." "That is a complete lie." Amanda snapped back, her eyes wide with frantic, unyielding anger. "We are a family. Family members rely on each other. But you do not care about that anymore, do you? You are just sitting there in your expensive black dress judging us. You think you are so incredibly independent and so perfectly put together, but you are really just a selfish, bitter person." Susan gasped loudly, placing a manicured hand dramatically over her heart. "Amanda," she warned softly, pretending to be shocked by the harsh words, even though she clearly agreed with every single syllable. "No, Mom. I am going to say it." Amanda continued, her voice growing even louder. "Someone finally needs to tell her the absolute truth. She is completely selfish. She refused to help David book the winter cabin because she wanted to punish him. She let me miss my expensive yoga class this morning knowing exactly how stressed out I was. She wants me to fail Mom. She is deeply, incredibly jealous of my husband and my children, so she is actively trying to sabotage my entire happiness." David shifted his heavy weight in his chair, picking up his empty wine glass and setting it back down. "She has a valid point, Rachel," he muttered, finally joining the harsh verbal attack. "Your sudden little strike is causing a massive amount of unnecessary tension in our marriage. Amanda is completely stressed out and she is taking it out on me. You are deliberately making our lives incredibly difficult just to prove you hold all the power." I looked at David, feeling a cold, sharp spike of sheer disbelief. He was blaming his own marital problems directly on my refusal to manage their personal schedules. The profound lack of accountability was truly breathtaking. "You are a grown man, David," I stated calmly, my voice steady and entirely flat. "If your marriage is under tension because I stopped reminding you to pay your own bills, then your marriage has much bigger problems than me." David flushed a dark, angry red, his jaw clenching tightly. "Do not you dare talk about my marriage," he warned, pointing a thick finger across the table. Susan slammed her hand down next to her plate. "That is enough," she demanded, her voice ringing out with sharp maternal authority. "Rachel, I simply will not tolerate this toxic, terrible attitude for another single second. You are ruining my anniversary dinner. You are attacking your sister and you are insulting your brother-in-law. You have become a cold, unfeeling, and completely unrecognizable woman." I sat perfectly still, letting the harsh, heavy insults wash over me. They were throwing every single emotional weapon they had in their arsenal. They were trying to trigger my deeply ingrained guilt, hoping I would immediately crumble and apologize for causing a scene. They wanted the familiar people-pleasing Rachel to suddenly rush back into the room and beg for their forgiveness. "You owe us a massive apology, Rachel," Amanda demanded, her voice shaking with intense, righteous fury. "You need to apologize to me, and you need to apologize to Mom. You are the one who broke this family apart, and you are the one who needs to fix it. Right now." The entire table fell completely silent. The soft jazz piano continued to play a strange, beautiful contrast to the ugly, heavy tension surrounding us. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs. The fear that used to paralyze me in these exact moments was completely gone. The desperate, painful need for their approval had finally vanished, leaving behind a clear, quiet space in my mind. "I am not going to apologize, Amanda," I said quietly. The words dropped onto the table like heavy lead weights. Amanda opened her mouth to scream, but I simply raised one single hand, a quiet, firm gesture that instantly stopped her in her tracks. I was completely finished listening to their endless selfish demands. It was finally my turn to speak. I lowered my hand, placing it gently back onto my lap. I looked directly at Amanda, feeling a profound, absolute stillness settling deep inside my chest. "I am not selfish, Amanda." I began, keeping my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. "I am just completely empty. I have spent the last 20 years pouring every single ounce of my energy into this family until there was absolutely nothing left for myself. Susan opened her mouth to interrupt, ready to launch another angry defense, but I did not let her speak. "Please just listen to me, Mom," I said, looking right into her wide, shocked eyes. "For once in your life, just sit there and truly listen. I am not yelling. I am not throwing a dramatic tantrum. I am simply telling you the truth." I turned my steady gaze back to my sister. "You asked me why I suddenly dropped everything," I continued, my words flowing out like a quiet, steady river. "You said I abandoned you without a single word of warning. But the warning signs have been there for years, Amanda. You just never bothered to look at them because my silent exhaustion was entirely convenient for you." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence wrap tightly around the table. "Do you remember when I ended up in the emergency room 3 years ago?" I asked, watching the color drain slightly from her face. "I had a severe panic attack. I genuinely thought I was having a heart attack. The emergency doctors told me my blood pressure was dangerously high and my stress levels were completely unsustainable." I looked at David, who was staring down at his empty plate. "When I called you, Amanda, from the cold hospital bed, you did not rush over to see if I was okay. You told me you were incredibly sorry, but you had already bought expensive tickets to a wine tasting event, and David could not find a reliable sitter. You asked me to call you when I got safely home." I took a dark, lonely cab back to my empty apartment, perfectly alone. Amanda swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward our mother. "That is not fair, Rachel," she whispered, her voice losing its sharp, aggressive edge. "We did not know it was that serious." "You did not know because you never actually asked," I replied calmly. "You never asked how I was doing. You only called when you needed a favor, a quick loan, or a free babysitter. You treated me exactly like a human utility closet. You opened the door, took exactly what you needed, and then firmly shut it, leaving me completely in the dark until the next time you needed something." I turned to Susan, who was gripping her white cloth napkin with pale, trembling knuckles. "And you, Mom," I said, feeling a deep, dull ache rising in my chest. "You designated me as the sturdy, reliable child. You decided that Amanda needed constant, unwavering protection, and you quietly made me her permanent bodyguard. You praised me for being incredibly useful, but you never actually praised me for simply being me. My entire worth in your eyes was entirely based on what I could physically provide for this family." Susan shook her head, hot tears suddenly welling up in her eyes. "That is simply not true, Rachel," she cried softly. "I love both of my daughters equally. You love the comfort I provide, Mom." I corrected her gently, feeling a strange, profound sadness wash over me. "You love the beautifully set holiday tables, the perfectly wrapped birthday gifts, and the seamlessly organized family vacations. But you do not love the heavy physical toll it takes on my body and my mind. You do not want to see the dark, heavy circles under my eyes, or hear about my own personal struggles. You just want the final polished result without ever acknowledging the incredibly high price I paid to give it to you." I paused, looking at my own hands resting quietly on the white linen. For 2 long decades, I was the designated shock absorber for this entire family. I explained, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet, elegant dining room. I absorbed all the daily stress, all the forgotten deadlines, and all the sudden emotional outbursts. I constantly smoothed over the rough edges, making sure none of you ever had to feel the sharp, painful sting of your own careless mistakes. I looked up, meeting their stunned, perfectly silent stares. "But a shock absorber eventually wears out," I said, my voice dropping to a fragile, incredibly honest whisper. "I am completely worn out. I cannot carry your heavy emotional weight anymore because it is literally crushing my spirit. I am not punishing you, Amanda. I am simply trying to survive. I am trying to find out who I actually am underneath all the heavy, suffocating layers of family obligation and quiet sacrifice. The table was perfectly, absolutely silent. The live jazz pianist finished his soft song, leaving a long, heavy pause hanging in the warm air. My family sat frozen in their wooden chairs, completely stripped of their defensive, loud anger. They were looking at me with wide, unblinking eyes as if they were truly seeing me for the very first time. I had laid my raw, bleeding heart right in the center of the elegant table. And for the very first time in 20 years, no one tried to sweep it away. The heavy, uncomfortable silence remained broken only by the quiet clinking of shiny silverware from the other dining tables. I did not stay for the expensive anniversary cake. I reached into my small black purse, pulling out 2 crisp $50 bills, and laid them softly next to my cold water glass. "This covers my portion of the meal," I said quietly. "Happy anniversary, Mom!" I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my dark dress. I did not wait for a response from the stunned, quiet table. I simply turned around and walked away. The long walk across the carpeted dining room felt incredibly freeing. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the cold, sharp night air. The restaurant parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by tall, flickering yellow streetlights. I pulled my warm wool coat tightly around my shoulders, shivering slightly in the brisk winter wind. The sound of my own footsteps echoed loudly against the damp black pavement. I reached my small car, digging deep into my pocket for my keys, ready to finally go to my quiet home. Suddenly, the heavy restaurant doors swung open again. "Rachel, wait!" a voice called out, cutting sharply through the cold night. I stopped, turning slowly around in the dim light. It was Amanda. She was hurrying across the dark asphalt, holding her thick winter coat together with one single hand. She was not running with her usual frantic anger. She was walking with a heavy, uncertain hesitation, her shoulders completely slumped forward. I did not get into my car. I leaned my tired back against the cold metal door, waiting quietly in the flickering yellow light. Amanda stopped a few feet away from me. Her chest was heaving slightly, her warm breath forming small white clouds in the freezing air. The bright streetlights cast long, dark shadows across her pale, exhausted face. Her eyes were red, completely stripped of their usual fierce defensiveness. We stood there in the quiet parking lot, completely alone. For a long, incredibly uncomfortable minute, neither of us said a single word. The distant, steady hum of highway traffic was the absolute only sound. "Rachel," she finally whispered, her voice trembling slightly in the cold wind. I did not know what to say in there. I honestly did not know what to do. I took a slow, deep breath, looking down at the gray, cracked pavement. "You did not have to say anything, Amanda," I replied softly. I was not looking for a loud argument. I just needed to finally tell the absolute truth. I needed to let the heavy words out before they completely suffocated me. Amanda crossed her arms tightly over her chest, shivering violently in the sharp breeze. "You really thought you were having a heart attack that day?" she asked, her voice dropping into a fragile, deeply broken tone. "You were in the hospital completely terrified, and I actually went to a fancy wine tasting." I nodded slowly, meeting her tearful, regretful gaze. "Yes," I confirmed quietly, the old familiar pain aching in my chest. I sat in the cold waiting room for 4 long hours, listening to the medical machines beep. I was so incredibly lonely, Amanda. I just wanted my sister to sit next to me and hold my hand. But I told you it was completely fine because I knew you were excited about your expensive plans. I always made it fine for you, even when I was completely falling apart. A single heavy tear slipped down the cold cheek of my sister. She reached up, wiping it away quickly with the back of her trembling hand. "I am so incredibly sorry, Rachel," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw, genuine pain. "I was so wrapped up in my own stressful world, I completely ignored yours. I just assumed you were completely invincible. You never complained about the heavy workload. You never asked for any help. You just handled everything perfectly all the time." "I was not invincible, Amanda," I said, feeling a deep, profound exhaustion in my tired bones. I was just terrified of letting anyone down. I thought my entire value was directly tied to my absolute usefulness. If I was not fixing a family problem, I thought I was completely worthless. So I just kept smiling and I kept saying yes until my body physically broke down. Amanda took a slow, hesitant step closer to me. The cold wind whipped her messy hair violently around her face. She looked so incredibly small standing under the flickering street lamp. She was finally seeing the heavy, invisible toll of her own carelessness. She was finally looking at me not as a reliable backup plan, but as a deeply flawed, exhausted human being. "You know," Amanda murmured, pulling her thick coat tighter around her shaking frame. "David and I fight all the time about the heavy mental load of raising the kids. I scream at him because he never notices what needs to be done. He fully expects me to manage the entire household and simply tell him what to do." She looked up at me, her red eyes filled with a sudden, incredibly painful realization. "And that is exactly what I have been doing to you, Rachel," she confessed, her voice breaking on my name. "I expected you to manage my entire emotional life, and I never even noticed the heavy, crushing labor it required." I nodded slowly, deeply appreciating her newfound quiet clarity. "Exactly, Amanda," I said softly. "You treated me like a personal manager, and you treated yourself like a completely helpless passenger, but you are not helpless at all. You are a strong, fully capable mother. You just let your emotional muscles atrophy because I was constantly doing all the heavy lifting for you." Amanda looked down at her expensive leather boots. The cold wind blew fiercely across the dark asphalt, rattling the bare branches of a nearby tree. She took a deep, shaky breath, letting it out in a long white cloud of fog. "I was so incredibly angry with you today," she admitted, her words tumbling out rapidly in the cold air. "When the babysitter canceled, I wanted to completely ruin your evening because I felt like you ruined my morning. It was so incredibly toxic, Rachel. I was acting like a spoiled, entitled child throwing a massive tantrum." I did not interrupt her sincere confession. I simply leaned against my car, letting her finally unpack her own heavy emotional baggage. "I was terrified of completely failing today," she continued, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "I was terrified of being a bad mother and a completely messy wife. It is so incredibly hard to keep the perfect family image together all by myself. When you suddenly stepped back this month, the entire beautiful illusion shattered. I realized I was completely failing at managing my own life, and it was so much easier to blame you than to look at my own reflection in the mirror." The heavy glass doors of the elegant restaurant slowly swung open again, completely breaking the quiet, frozen stillness of the dark parking lot. I turned my head, pulling my thick wool coat tighter against the sharp, biting wind. A tall, familiar figure stepped out into the bright yellow glow of the streetlights. It was our mother, Susan. She was entirely alone. She did not have the harsh, commanding presence that usually followed her into every single room. Without the fancy restaurant lighting and the expensive wine, she simply looked like a very tired, incredibly fragile older woman. Amanda wiped her wet face, sniffing quietly as we watched our mother slowly walk across the cold, cracked asphalt. Susan wrapped her dark scarf tightly around her neck, shivering as the freezing wind hit her perfectly styled hair. She approached my small parked car, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty lot. She stopped right next to Amanda, looking at both of us with deep, incredibly swollen eyes. "I heard everything you said in there." "Rachel?" Susan whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the heavy words. "I sat at that big empty table and I watched you walk away from us. For the very first time in my entire life, I truly thought you were never coming back. I looked at my mother, feeling a strange, hollow ache in my chest. I am standing right here, Mom," I replied softly, keeping my voice incredibly steady and completely calm. But the old version of me, the version that simply existed to fix your constant mistakes, is completely gone. I cannot be that person anymore because she almost died trying to keep you both perfectly comfortable. Susan let out a sharp, painful sob, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. "I failed you, Rachel," she cried out, the raw, ugly truth finally breaking through her thick defensive armor. "I completely failed you as a mother. I was so incredibly terrified that Amanda would struggle in the real world. I completely sacrificed your happiness to build a safe, comfortable bubble for her. I took your incredible strength for granted because it was just so incredibly easy for me." Amanda reached out gently, placing her hand on the shaking shoulder of our mother. "We both took her for granted, Mom," Amanda added quietly, looking down at the dark, icy pavement. "We used her like a permanent emotional crutch, and we got angry when she finally asked us to simply walk on our own 2 feet. Susan looked up at me, her face completely stripped of its usual sharp arrogance. "I am so incredibly deeply sorry, my sweet, beautiful daughter," she wept, stepping closer and reaching out her shaking hands. "I am sorry I never asked about your lonely hospital visit. I am sorry I never thanked you for the beautiful holidays and the endless invisible labor. I robbed you of your own joyful life simply because I was too lazy to manage my own." I looked down at her small, trembling hands, reaching out for my forgiveness. The deep, ingrained instinct to immediately hug her, to soothe her loud tears, and to tell her everything was completely fine flared up violently in my chest. It was a very powerful, deeply addictive urge, but I stood my ground. I did not rush forward to comfort her because true, lasting healing required sitting quietly in the uncomfortable pain. "I accept your apology, Mom," I said, feeling a hot single tear finally slip down my cold cheek. "I really appreciate you saying those heavy words out loud. But an apology does not magically fix 20 years of deeply toxic habits. We cannot just hug, go back inside the restaurant, and pretend this massive explosion never happened." Susan lowered her hands, nodding slowly in complete understanding. "I know, Rachel," she whispered, wiping her wet face. "I know we have a massive amount of incredibly hard work to do, but I want to do the hard work. I want to actually know my real daughter, not just the helpful, quiet assistant I selfishly forced you to become." Amanda stepped closer, standing right next to our mother under the flickering yellow light. "How do we even begin to fix this?" Amanda asked, her voice filled with quiet, genuine desperation. "How do we learn to be a real family without you constantly standing in the middle and holding all the heavy, broken pieces together?" "We start by carrying our own weight," I explained smoothly, looking back and forth between the 2 women I loved so deeply. "From now on, I am completely retiring from the planning committee. If we decide to have a family dinner, everyone brings a dish. If we go on a vacation, we divide the planning and the financial cost completely equally. If you have a crisis, Amanda, I will happily listen to you vent on the phone, but I will not rush over to fix it for you." Amanda took a deep, steadying breath, nodding her head in firm, complete agreement. "That is absolutely fair, Rachel," she replied softly. I need to learn how to manage my own chaotic household without constantly treating you like a free, unpaid employee. And I will start managing my own social calendar, Susan added, offering a small, deeply fragile smile. I can call the doctor myself, Rachel. I am a perfectly capable adult, and it is high time I started acting exactly like one. I looked at my family standing together in the freezing dark parking lot. The elegant anniversary dinner was completely ruined, but something entirely new and incredibly beautiful was slowly beginning to take root in the cold asphalt. It was not a magical, perfect fix. I knew there would be incredibly difficult days ahead. I knew they would accidentally slip back into their old demanding habits, and I knew I would have to firmly enforce my boundaries over and over again. But for the very first time in my entire adult life, I felt a deep, profound sense of genuine hope. The heavy, invisible burden was finally lifted from my tired shoulders and divided into 3 equal, manageable pieces. I reached out slowly, pulling my mother and my sister into a cold, completely honest embrace. We stood together under the street lamp. 3 grown women finally ready to build a real, healthy relationship completely based on mutual respect and shared heavy burdens. 6 long months passed since that cold winter night in the restaurant parking lot. The bright spring sun washed warmly over the wooden deck of my mother. It was a beautiful, clear Sunday afternoon. The air smelled of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. We were gathering for a simple weekend lunch, but the familiar heavy dread in my stomach was completely gone. I parked my small car in the driveway. I did not rush out with heavy bags of groceries. I simply carried a small covered plate of homemade brownies. I walked up the concrete path, listening to the loud, chaotic sounds of my family. I opened the front door, stepping into the bright hallway. The house was noisy, but it was a very different kind of noise. It was not the sound of angry complaints or panicked demands. It was the sound of actual shared effort. I walked into the kitchen, placing my simple dessert on the counter. My mother, Susan, was standing near the hot stove. She wore a bright yellow apron, carefully watching a simmering pot of soup. She did not look frantic, and she did not immediately hand me a wooden spoon. "Hello, Rachel." Susan smiled, wiping her hands on a small towel. "I am so incredibly glad you made it. The soup is almost ready, but I think I added a little too much salt." I walked over, leaning casually against the kitchen island. "I am sure it will taste perfectly fine, Mom," I replied softly. "It smells absolutely delicious." The back door swung open loudly. Amanda walked in carrying a massive plastic bowl of green salad. Her hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and she looked a little flushed from the warm weather. She set the heavy bowl down next to my brownies, letting out a long, theatrical sigh. "I chopped exactly 50 cherry tomatoes," Amanda announced proudly. "And I completely forgot to buy croutons, so we are just going to eat it exactly like this." "That is perfectly fine, Amanda," I laughed, picking up a bright red tomato and eating it. "It looks incredibly fresh, and I am starving." David followed closely behind her, carrying a tall stack of paper plates and a handful of plastic forks. He did not immediately sit down on the comfortable sofa and pull out his cell phone. He walked straight past us, heading out to the wooden patio to set up the outdoor dining table. "Where do you want the napkins, Susan?" David called out through the open screen door. "Just put them right in the middle, David." Susan answered loudly, stirring her large pot of soup. "And please make sure the boys do not let the dog out of the yard." I watched them move around the sunny kitchen. The entire scene was incredibly imperfect. The salad was missing ingredients, the soup was slightly too salty, and we were eating off cheap paper plates. But it was the most beautiful meal I had ever seen because I was not the only person preparing it. The heavy invisible burden of perfection was completely lifted from the room. We were simply existing together, sharing the basic necessary chores of family life. I did not feel the sudden desperate urge to rush in and fix the salty soup. I did not offer to run to the grocery store just to buy a bag of crunchy croutons. I simply stood there sipping a glass of cold water and enjoying the warm, comfortable space I was finally allowed to occupy. Amanda walked over, standing right next to me. She bumped her shoulder gently against mine, offering a small, genuine smile. "Thank you for coming today, Rach," she said quietly. "I know Sundays used to be incredibly stressful for you." "It is completely different now, Amanda," I replied softly, returning her warm smile. "I am genuinely happy to be here." David walked back inside, clapping his hands together loudly. "The table is completely set," he announced, looking around the busy kitchen. "And the boys are actually sitting down waiting patiently. If we do not feed them soon, they might completely destroy the backyard." "Let us eat," Susan declared, picking up a large metal ladle. "Grab a paper bowl, everyone, and serve yourselves. I am not running a fancy restaurant today." We formed a slow, messy line around the kitchen island. Nobody complained about the casual presentation. We filled our paper bowls, laughing about the missing croutons and talking about our busy work weeks. We walked out onto the bright sunny patio, taking our seats around the large wooden table. The warm spring breeze blew softly through the green trees, carrying the sweet scent of blooming flowers. I sat at the end of the table, listening to the chaotic, joyful conversation. Amanda was telling a funny story about a mistake she made at work, and David was actually laughing out loud. Susan was feeding a small piece of chicken to the family dog, completely ignoring her strict old rules about table manners. The heavy, dark cloud of resentment that used to hang over our family gatherings was entirely gone. I looked down at my simple paper bowl filled with salty soup and unevenly chopped tomatoes. It tasted absolutely incredible. It tasted like freedom. It tasted like a family that was finally learning how to support each other without completely crushing one single person in the incredibly painful process. I took a deep, contented breath, feeling the warm sun on my face. The concrete foundation I used to carry on my tired shoulders was finally resting exactly where it belonged, spread evenly across the ground, supporting all of us equally. After the simple, joyful lunch was completely finished, the cleanup was entirely a team effort. David grabbed a large black trash bag, collecting the messy paper plates and the dirty napkins. Amanda carried the heavy soup pot directly to the kitchen sink, running the hot water and grabbing a soapy sponge. Susan packed the leftover salad into small plastic containers, chatting happily with her young grandsons. I picked up my empty water glass and quietly stepped away from the busy kitchen. I walked out the front door, stepping onto the quiet, shaded porch. I sat down on the soft cushions of the wooden glider, pushing my feet gently against the wooden floorboards. The glider rocked slowly, a steady, incredibly peaceful rhythm. The neighborhood was perfectly quiet. A gentle spring breeze rustled the bright green leaves of the large oak tree in the front yard. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the soft outdoor cushion. I listened to the muffled, distant sounds of my family laughing inside the house. I did not feel the frantic, burning need to rush back inside and help them scrub the dishes. I knew Amanda was perfectly capable of washing a pot. I knew David could handle taking out the trash. For 20 long years, I truly believed that setting boundaries would completely destroy my family. I was absolutely terrified that if I stopped doing everything for them, they would simply stop loving me. I thought my entire value was directly attached to my endless sacrifices. But I was incredibly wrong. Setting a firm boundary did not destroy our love. It completely saved it. I opened my eyes looking out at the calm, empty street. The deep, heavy exhaustion that used to live permanently in my bones was finally gone. I felt incredibly light. I felt incredibly strong. I had finally found my own voice completely buried underneath decades of silent resentment. I learned how to say the incredibly hard word no. I learned how to tolerate their temporary anger, knowing it was a completely necessary step toward lasting genuine respect. The front door slowly creaked open. Susan stepped out onto the quiet porch holding 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea. She walked over, sitting down gently beside me on the wooden glider. She handed me a warm ceramic mug, offering a soft, peaceful smile. "It is incredibly beautiful out here today," Susan murmured, taking a slow sip of her hot tea. "I thought you might want a quiet minute to yourself before the boys come out here to play." "Thank you, Mom," I said softly, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. It really is a beautiful day. We rocked back and forth, completely silent for several long minutes. It was not the heavy, tense silence of the past. It was a comfortable, deeply easy silence. It was the quiet space between 2 adult women who were finally learning how to simply exist together without any demanding expectations. "I am really proud of you, Rachel," Susan suddenly whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the green oak tree. "I am proud of the incredibly strong woman you are, and I am deeply proud that you finally demanded the absolute respect you always deserved." I looked at my mother, feeling a bright, warm glow spread slowly through my chest. The endless, desperate search for her genuine approval was officially over. I did not need to earn it anymore, because I finally knew I was entirely worthy of it just by simply being myself. "I am proud of us, Mom," I replied softly, leaning my shoulder gently against hers. "We survived the absolute worst of it, and we built something so much better." I took a slow sip of the sweet herbal tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat. I looked back at the closed front door, knowing my sister and my brother-in-law were inside managing their own messy lives. The ripple effect of my choices had completely shifted the entire landscape of our family. I stopped overcompensating, and they finally stepped up to fill the empty space. I rested my head back, closing my eyes one final time. I was no longer the invisible glue holding a broken system together. I was simply Rachel. I was a sister, a daughter, and a completely independent woman who finally loved herself enough to simply let go. The heavy burden was finally down, and my hands were entirely free to build a beautiful, quiet life of my very own. True love within a family is not measured by how much of yourself you give away until you are completely empty. Setting boundaries is a profound act of love for both yourself and your family. A healthy dynamic requires shared burdens, mutual respect, and the courage to speak up.